So welcome everyone. Hello, Barbara. Welcome everyone to a conversation with Alison Wray. Thank you, Alison, so much for giving your time today. I know that time is precious at the moment, so really do appreciate this. Welcome everyone. We've got quite a nice mix of people on with us today. Lots of empowered colleagues, which is fantastic. But we've got a good mix of other people as well joining us today. So if you haven't been to one of these before, this is a conversation with, and my name is Emma Smith. I'm the project manager with Empowered Conversations, which is an Age UK Salford project. We deliver communication courses for family carers across Greater Manchester, and we also offer one-to-one support for family carers in Salford, soon to be Bolton, which will start up in April. So welcome everyone. You've already had a little play in the chat at the bottom. If you have any questions as we're going along, please pop them in the Q&A, and we will make sure that we have time at the end to pick up those questions. Okay. All right. I think I've done all of my business that I need to do. So, Alison, I'm bringing up my questions now. Can you see how smooth I am at this? So, well, our biggest topic of conversation today is this book, Why Dementia Makes Communication Difficult. So, Alison, who's this book aimed at?
Well, this book is aimed at non-academics. Most of the work that I do, most of the writing I do is for academics. And I did write a very big, fat, very technical book that was published in 2020 on the same topic. And I thought, no, I want something that's a little bit more accessible to people who don't want to read all the theory and all the detail. So this book's aimed at family members of people living with a dementia, family carers, professional carers, other health professionals, also what I call occasional bystanders. So it's suitable for hairdressers, plumbers, taxi drivers, vicars, the kinds of people who encounter somebody living with a dementia from time to time and might wonder how to communicate a bit better with them. But actually, it's also to an extent aimed at people living with a dementia themselves. So I've tried to approach the topics in a way that's sensitive to that and to give pointers that people can use for themselves if they have a dementia diagnosis, so that they can try and figure out ways that will make their own life a little bit easier and perhaps make the life of other people around them a little bit easier in due course.
And I seem to remember that you had some input as well from people with dementia in the book.
I did indeed, yes. I had very helpful input from somebody who read the entire manuscript for me and gave a lot of very useful ideas on ways to just reframe things and so on, yeah.
Fantastic. It's something that we all take for granted, Alison, but why do we communicate? What are we trying to do when we communicate?
Well, if you ask different people, they'll give you different answers on this. Going to give you my answer to this. We live in a very complicated world of our own experience, a world that's changing all the time. And so if we want to keep that world comfortable for ourselves, we need to change little things all the time. If it gets a bit cold in the room, we want to make it a little bit warmer. If we get thirsty, we might want a drink and so on. If we are lacking some information, we want that information. So it's like we're trying to tweak our experiential world all the time just to make it more convenient and comfortable for us. Now, a lot of the things that we might want to tweak in our world, we can do for ourselves. So if I'm thirsty, I can just go and make a cup of tea. But quite a lot of the things we might want to change in our world, we can't change for ourselves. We've got to get somebody else to get involved. If we want some information, for example, we may need to ask somebody. If I want a cup of coffee when I'm out, I'm going to have to go to a cafe and negotiate to get that from somebody and pay some money for it. So there are lots of times when we communicate in order to get other people to do something that will benefit us. Now, that might sound really selfish, that might seem like it's very one-sided, but actually when you look at it in more detail, you realize that most of the time we're all really happy to support other people in getting the things that they need to make their life a little bit better, because often it links up with things that we want to improve to make our lives better and so on. And so it's not really a battle most of the time. It's a kind of cooperation, a give and take that works really well.
And I'm just thinking that when we communicate, you talk about that we've got our own agendas and how our own agendas might impact on the response that somebody gives us. Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so first of all, the agendas thing is what I was really just talking about, which is that, you know, we've got things we want to achieve through communication that will make our life a little bit better at that moment. So that's our agenda, if you like. And this idea that we want to control our world, really, you can dig right back to being a basic survival need. It's very much built into us. And as a result, if we don't get the things that we feel we need or we want, that can be very, very emotionally powerful for us. It doesn't take long before we start feeling a little bit anxious, a little bit angry, disempowered, and so on. Now, so that's the kind of a backdrop for everybody. Now, of course, the problem is that when somebody's living with a dementia, we know there are difficulties with communication. And so it may mean that a message we put across to them, they don't receive. They don't respond in the way we expected. Or they might give us some kind of message because they want to change something in their world. And we can't quite understand what it was that they meant. And so one way or another, both worlds very often end up in a worse state than they were before rather than a better state. And that's really quite disconcerting for us. We can find that upsetting. It can even sometimes be quite dangerous. And so, of course, we're all the time trying to manage that and get things back on track. But here is a real crux thing about the situation with dementia, because there's this massive power imbalance. If there are two people in a conversation and one of them is living with a dementia, it's very, very easy for the other person, whether they're a family member or a carer, whatever, to start to impose their preferences. You know, I want to change my world in this way, and you're the person who's got dementia, so you're the one who's making that difficult for me. So I'm just going to overrule you. I'm going to do something that I want. And that can leave the person living with a dementia feeling powerless, overlooked. Often they'll get depressed. And so the thing about our own agendas, particularly in that situation, that applies to every kind of communication we have, is developing an awareness of why we say the things we do. What are we trying to achieve? What's in it for us that we get this or that different kind of outcome? Sometimes we'll realize that we could back off. So let me just give you one silly example. It's something that, you know, you read about often, you see in films and so on. So imagine the daughter goes to the house of a woman living with dementia, and she opens up the kitchen cupboard and there are 20 packets of biscuits. And so the daughter says, "Why do you keep buying biscuits? You've got a whole cupboard." And her mother says, "Well, it's my money. So if I want to go down to the shop and buy biscuits, why shouldn't I? It's not doing anybody any harm," which is, of course, quite true, quite reasonable. So, but the daughter gets frustrated and cross. And so you think, why? Why does the daughter care so much that there are loads of biscuits in the cupboard? And it might be something to do with the fact that the daughter really wishes that her mother hadn't changed in this way. She wants her to go back to how she was. And so she kind of feels that if she tells her not to buy biscuits, that will help to take her mother back to how she was before she had dementia, which of course isn't really going to work. But what the daughter might do is step back and think, well, what impact would it have on her mother to stop her even doing that pretty harmless thing of going out to the shop and buying some biscuits? You know, that could really be quite damaging her, that she's lost that little bit of control over her life. And so what the daughter might do is think about whether there are some alternatives. Each situation would be different, each person would be different. But just to give one example, the daughter might say, "Oh, I've heard that the local club, some kind of club, is short of biscuits at the moment. Would you like to donate a couple of packets to the club?" Now, what she's done there is she's helped keep the number of biscuits down in the cupboard, but she's also helped her mother to feel that buying biscuits is actually of value and is useful to people. So she's managed to do something for somebody else, which could just help her feel a little bit more empowered, perhaps at a time when she's feeling that she doesn't have very much control over her life anymore.
No, I like that one. And that option, there's no shaming in that, is there? So the first option of like trying to say no more biscuits, mum, you know, there's a shame there, isn't there? The mum's probably aware that she's got too many biscuits in the cupboard whenever she looks at it at that moment, but the option of donating, yeah, nice, it's a nice option. And I suppose that just means that we as carers have to have that reflective time and that time to check in with ourselves and what our own agendas are and what we're trying to change. I also thought, as you were saying, I was thinking about professional carers or people in a professional context. You know, they've got very sort of set agendas, haven't they? Whether it's some set questions or a set period of time that they can spend with someone. And that's quite rigid, and it's sort of it makes it quite tricky for them to drop those agendas or maybe just reframe them.
Yeah, I mean, it can be, and it does vary. I mean, I've read situations where in a residential facility, for example, the carer is saying, "Come on, you're going to have a shower," and the person's saying, "I don't want a shower," and they say, "Well, you have to have a shower because you have to have it now because it's on my list to do," and you can see that is helpful and that a little bit more flexibility would be good. But then that member of staff may be being judged on whether they get through their list or not. And then you could also have a situation where they're saying, "Come on, you need a shower because, you know, actually you're a bit smelly and we need to get you clean." And if the person then is doing that, then that's much more difficult because they really do need to be persuaded. These are really, really hard situations to deal with. But it is about standing back and just seeing it for what it is. To what extent am I fighting this battle unnecessarily? You know, there may be other battles I do need to fight, but maybe not this one. And just having a little bit more confidence about reflecting on what's going on without feeling that it's suddenly all your fault or you're doing everything wrong. You're not. These are really hard situations, but it's just about being able to step back and think about what might be going on and whether somebody else, for example, might respond differently and what options there might be for you to make a different decision. That's all.
And I think that confidence is a big thing, isn't it? I know on our courses, quite often the carers just want to be validated that they're doing a good job, because nobody else has done that job before. They don't know anybody around them who's a family carer. So coming on a course and having somebody else saying, yeah, that, you know, that was the right thing to do, makes them feel good and increases their confidence.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the bottom line is if you're approaching what you're doing with, you know, with attention to what's going on and with kindness and a desire to care, you're not going to go very far wrong. You know, things may go wrong, but that's not the same as you've done something wrong. Things will go wrong all on their own. So confidence comes from feeling that your heart's in the right place and that you're trying to do as well as you can in a situation that's really, really hard.
Talking of things that go wrong, in your book, you spend quite a lot of time talking about context tracking and how that can undermine communication. So I'm thinking of wondered if you give us an example around that.
Yeah, sure. So what I mean by context tracking is the context is all the information that we have about a situation that we're in at any given time. So we're clocking all the time where we are, who we're with, what's happened already, and so on. So we do this all the time. We take it all up and build it into a kind of our model of what the world is like. And this is important because we will behave differently and speak differently in different contexts. So for example, if you were trying to go somewhere and there's somebody standing in your way and you need to ask them to let you go past, the way you do that is going to be very different depending on whether it's some tiresome child in a supermarket who's running around all over the place and getting in everybody's way, whether it's a grieving relative at a funeral, or whether it's the Queen at her own garden party. You know, it would be the same thing we wanted to achieve, but we would express it in completely different ways because of the context. So if you want to get somebody to respond to you in a desired way that's going to help make your world a little bit better, for example, move out of the way or help you carry something or give you some information or be quiet or whatever it might be you want them to do, you've got to craft how you're going to say that to them according to the context. It will determine what words you use, might even determine which language you use if you speak more than one, how polite you are, your tone of voice, all of these kinds of things. And the context is changing all the time. You've got to keep track of it. So you've got to know, for example, what you think they already know, so you don't need to tell them, and what you think they think you already know, so that they won't be expecting you to need to know it, and so on. Now, this is a really cognitively difficult thing to do. We spend a lot of attention on this. We're tracking this all the time. And if you get out of sync on it, so one person has one set of expectations and somebody else has a different about the context, then that will lead to misunderstandings. In fact, a great deal of comedy, a lot of situation comedy is based on these kinds of misunderstandings, two people thinking that the situation is slightly different. So it can be funny, but very often it's really quite distressing. So the problem is that when somebody is living with a dementia, the dementia can affect how easily they can keep track of all of that contextual information. For example, if they have a memory difficulty, then they may not recall things that have just happened, things that have just been said, and so on, or not recall who somebody is, even though they were introduced to them. There can also be difficulties, even if they don't have a memory problem, with processing speed. So how fast they can take information in and keep up with it and put it all together into a big picture. Now, if they can't track all of that effectively, then they won't be sure what it's okay to say, what it's appropriate to say. And other people, meanwhile, won't know what information they do and don't have, because they won't be able to tell what they have and haven't tracked. And that can cause major problems for a person living with a dementia. So, for example, if I can move into that really, there are three, I suppose, main effects that there can be for a person living with a dementia that relate to context. And one is that because they haven't gauged what contextual information is in full, they might say the wrong thing, or they might say something in the wrong way, or they might repeat themselves, ask a question that's already been answered because they don't recall that, it's not part of their context, and so on. Now, when they do that, it could very easily, for somebody that they're talking to, it could cause confusion. You know, why did you say that? Why did you ask that? Surely you know that already. Or why would you ask when the train's due? We're not in a train station. So it could cause confusion. It could also cause offense. You know, they might say something which is not appropriate in that context, but they haven't realized that. And lead to anxiety on both people's part. We don't like it when we have these misunderstandings. So it leads to negative emotions on both parts, frustration and anger and so on. Now, if a person living with dementia on account of this kind of misunderstanding gets frustrated, so they say something, ask a question, they're told, you don't need to ask that, I've already told you. They get frustrated because they don't know the answer to the question and they can't recall it. If there's a good chance they'll get labeled as difficult, awkward, argumentative, when in fact they're just trying to make their world make sense. Now, if they live in a residential care home, they may find that they get plonked in a corner, out of the way, when all they were really trying to do was just kind of figure out what was going on and establish some information. If the other person, the person who isn't living with a dementia, gets frustrated or hurt or whatever, it's quite likely that they will, you know, at some point explode. They will express that kind of frustration. May get frightened, they may be embarrassed, they may feel humiliated because it's all gone wrong, they may get upset, and in due course they may start to withdraw from the interaction because they feel it's too dangerous. They don't like to say something in case they get it wrong, and that's really quite a dangerous situation to get into, because that's really not good for them. But of course, the reason that the other person did respond in that way is quite natural. It's because of this deep survival instinct that we have to keep our world making sense to us. And here comes somebody saying something that kind of throws that and says, hang on, I thought the situation was this, but now it seems it's that, and now I'm confused. And that very, very deeply alarms us, and sometimes sort of respond in quite a strong way. And it takes quite a lot of skill to be able to notice that and draw back on that before it turns into something that gets to sort of
Thank you for that one, Alison. Sorry, I just had a delivery driver knocking at my door and I was like, I'm going to ignore you because I'm busy. Please go away. But obviously the impact of that are 2 dogs barking. So I hope that's not coming through.
We didn't hear the dogs.
Okay, that's good. All right. Okay, so this is something that I've noticed, and I know it's something that colleagues have talked about. So notice that people with dementia can use certain phrases that don't quite fit in with the conversation, but they seem to work enough to keep the conversation going. And I wondered if you could give me some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we like to achieve in our world is making communication work. So even if we're not really following what's going on, or we're not really sort of understanding where it's going, we will try and keep the conversation going, because that's really quite important to us. And so there are lots of phrases that we all use, we all do this, that can just be used and put in to just indicate, yes, keep going, keep going. So we say like, oh, really? Or, oh, dear, or that's nice. They're relatively easy to plonk in just about the right situation, even if you're not entirely following what's being said. So if a person's living with a dementia and they're not really quite tracking all of the context, so they're not quite sure who's being talked about or what event's being talked about or why this is important, because they didn't quite pick up all that information and retain it, they can still use little phrases like that, which indicate, I'm still with you, I'm still with you. I mean, they're not really still with the conversation. It would be nice if they could get a bit more clarification, but for as long as they can't, they will use those to just kind of carry on being a participant in the conversation. So it's good in a way because it keeps them involved. But if one's alert to that, if you start to hear a lot of these rather almost empty phrases being put in, that is a signal. It could be a signal that the person really hasn't quite followed. And it might be a good idea to just kind of backtrack, put a few names back in, put a few places back in to give them a few clues so that they can have another go at putting that story together so that they can understand what's being said.
So if we're alert to that and we're looking out for that, I like the idea that we can then think, and we do have to think on our feet, don't we, with this? So thinking on our feet, oh, wait a minute, I need to slow it down. I might need to put a few more clues in there and get this person back in the conversation rather than ploughing on at whatever speed we're going at. Yeah,
it's going to be little things like, for example, if you're in the middle of a story about Jenny, you know, as you said Jenny at the beginning, and this person you're talking to may not have recalled that it's about Jenny. So now they think, oh, who are you talking about? What's going on? Instead of just saying, and she said, and I saw her, you just say, and Jenny said, and then suddenly, oh, you're talking about Jenny. And it just gives them a chance to sort of get back on the bus, if you like, so they can do a bit more of the journey with you rather than running behind.
Okay, yeah, no, I like that. That's great. So you spend a bit of time in the book sharing with us when a conversation gets awkward, and we've all been in those awkward conversations. You've got 5 principles for resolving awkward moments, and I wondered if you could share them. I'm going to make a note of them just for my own personal life, but so the 5 principles.
So when I talk about awkward moments, I'm really talking about those situations where you know, one person has said something, the person living with dementia has said something back, and now the first person isn't sure from that whether the person living with the dementia really understood what they said or not, and therefore they don't really know what to say next, because they don't know whether to explain it, because that might not be necessary. They don't know whether to just assume that it's been understood, because it might not have been. And these awkward moments can happen really quite easily. Somebody says something that feels a bit inappropriate. Now what do I say? So often in the things we read about conversation, it's just about person A says something, person B says something back. But actually, very often the most tricky thing is the third turn, when it goes back to person A and they have to respond to what person B has said, and that can be hard. So the principles that I came up with are, the first one is, and this comes back to confidence again, really, it's about learning to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty. A lot of the time in the conversations, you won't know what's been understood and what to say next. And you haven't kind of failed because you got it's just not knowable. And because it's not knowable, you have to just tolerate and just say, oh, do you know what? This is one of those situations where I don't know what to say. I'm not sure what's going on here. So the first principle is give yourself a break here, and don't expect things that are just impossible for yourself. You can't know that thing, so don't expect to. You've got to work with it rather than feeling that you somehow failed because you didn't understand something, or because you feel a bit embarrassed, which you often will in that situation. The second principle then is to approach the situation with kindness. I've already mentioned that, with compassion and kindness. So try and modify your expectations about what the other person can do to match what you gauge as actually being possible for the person now. So try and step away from the reason this is difficult is because you're not doing something that I wish you could do. Well, if they can't do it, they can't do it. And trying to come in and think, well, you know, what do they need right now? What's appropriate right now? I find it interesting as a kind of thought experiment to imagine somebody else coming in and standing in your place, somebody who didn't have all of that history, all of that baggage, all of those feelings, somebody who was just a stranger. If they came in, what would they do? And then just saying, well, could I do a bit of that? Could I step back from it and just bring more kindness in if I could put down some of those frustrations and anxieties and sadnesses that we often carry around in this situation? The third principle is about taking an interest in learning what works. So treating it like a kind of a puzzle that gives you clues. So, oh, that didn't seem to go down very well, or that seemed to work quite well. I wonder why that is. I wonder if I could expand on that. Things will still go wrong. If you experiment like that, things will go wrong, but it won't matter so much because, oh, I tried that didn't work. That's okay, let me try something else. And what it does is it gives you a bit more sense of agency. You know, I'm trying to get from A to B. I may have to go around the circuitous route, but that's okay. Let me just try different routes and see. A bit like trying to find your way through the woods after a storm and there are trees down everywhere. I can't go that way. I better try this other way, and so on. So it makes it a bit more interesting and gives you a little bit more confidence to not mind when things go wrong. I think that's really, really important. The next thing is to be adaptable, to go with the flow. So try and be flexible, to notice what's working now, even if it might not work tomorrow, or try something now, even if it didn't work yesterday. Try things out and take note of what's working. If the person you're engaging with is feeling very low, go with the fact they're feeling low and see what you can do to support them so they don't feel so low. Try that rather than doing whatever it was you had planned to do with them. So try and take notice of the situation and adapting to it. And then the final thing, I actually mentioned earlier about choosing your battles. There will be so many challenges in just the daily engagement with a person living with a dementia, that you need to decide which ones are important and which ones aren't. Which things can you just let go, and which things really do you need to focus on, so that you don't wear yourself out and wear the other person out with making everything into a battle. It doesn't need to be. A lot of things it just doesn't matter. I mean, if you give somebody a cup of tea and they don't drink it, there's no need to get cross about that. You know why? That's just not important. There may be other things where you need to put a little bit more engagement into, like taking their medication or something. So save your energies for that, and then you can be a bit more kind and constructive when you come to that.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. So, and there's sort of one of what I took from that is sort of being good enough is, good enough is good enough.
Yeah,
I think all of us beat ourselves up that we're not the best at this, or I'm not the best at that, I'm not the best carer, I'm not the best wife. But being good enough, having some curiosity, being a bit of a detective, having that adaptability and choosing your battles. Sound advice. Carers that we work with will often say that the person with dementia has become a different person. What advice would you give to a carer around that?
Dementia definitely can change a person. I mean, the brain damage can do that. It can alter the way the brain works. It can alter emotions, alters the way people think, what they recall. So it genuinely can change the person in quite significant ways. But another thing that can change a person is how treated. And so sometimes it's worth thinking about the extent to which part of the reason they're changing is to do with the experiences they're now having, and also how that's changing you as a carer, because you also will change because you take on a different role, you have different worries, different concerns, and so on. And so it's very easy to get into a situation where you both change in ways that are detrimental to both of you. And so looking for opportunities to modify the way you approach the situation that will give you a chance to be a different, the kind of person you want to be, and not change in negative ways, but also the person living with the dementia the chance to hang on to some of the things that they can still do. A simple example is if you start doing everything for the person, you just sit there and I'll do it because it's a lot easier and a lot quicker. Well, that's taking away their sense of any agency. And it's also meaning they're not getting up and moving about. They're not having to think about how to do things. And even though it, may take them longer and they may make mistakes, it may be that it's actually better for them to be up and about and doing things. There may be other things you can give them to do rather than just thinking that you're being nice to them, pretend it's a hotel, sit there and just, I'll do everything for you. That might not be the best thing for them. So you can't reverse dementia, but keep an eye on how your own agendas, the things that are important to you, like I've got so much to do, I've got to get through this, I haven't got time to deal with this person doing this, I'll just put them over there so I can get on. How those things might be making it more difficult for the person living with the dementia, and just experiment a little bit with little things that might be done. Folding things is something that's often done in residential care homes, giving people with dementia things to fold, things that really need folding, or preparing some vegetables that really need. This is real things that people can do that will keep them occupied and keep them feeling they're actually making a contribution. So experiment to see what might help that person most, so that they can reconnect with aspects of their core identity and their personality, and connect with things that they have known how to do. I mean, they might have been really good at knitting. Now, well, if you're not so good at knitting and you keep dropping stitches, get them to help you, put the knitting right. That might be something they can still do, and that would make them feel much more empowered.
So we're doing with rather than a doing for.
Absolutely. Where possible. It's not always possible, but it's just having an eye on where the opportunities might be, but not trying to, you can't refashion your situation into one that really doesn't work. I mean, you know best what your situation is, and you've got to figure out what the options are there. It's just having the confidence to be creative and imaginative about it.
It's making me think about driving such a massive thing for people with dementia when they can't drive anymore. And at the weekend I'd gone home to visit the family and I was the driver, so I made my stepdad the navigator, and he had to tell me every direction, because I don't know the town that we're living, I don't know where we're going, you've got to tell me where we're going. And it really felt like he'd built his confidence back in the car. He'd not been in the car for 3 months. So it really felt like he'd built his own confidence of being back in the car, enjoying that control over me, because I was driving and he was telling me where to go. Yeah. But he had the power.
Yeah, exactly. And it was a genuinely useful thing as well.
That's good. Okay, this is a tricky one. So a few years ago, we had a daughter on an Empowered Conversations course whose mum had dementia. Sadly, her brother had died suddenly a year earlier. And mum kept forgetting about his death, and the family had become trapped in a cycle of grief, so much so that that she would avoid mentioning her brother at all in the presence of her mum. So she just wasn't ever speaking about her brother. Like, the good stories weren't being talked about because she was so worried that it was going to spark a conversation about her brother, and then it would all come out again. And there's no simple answer around that, but have you any thoughts on how that daughter could have approached that situation?
This is a really, really difficult one. I mean, there are two things tied up here. One is not mentioning the brother, so he kind of gets edited out of the family story. And then the other thing is around what you would say to the mum about where he was, because obviously if you do talk to him, she says, oh, I haven't seen him for a long time, then are you going to break the news to her again if she doesn't now recall that he's died? Are you going to break the news to her again, in which case she's going to go into a whole load of grief again? Or are you going to say something that isn't true, like, oh, he's been busy at work, he'll be along soon, or something, which would make her feel, okay, fine, that's all right. But true. And this is a massive, massive dilemma that runs right the way through dementia care. And there's been a huge amount written about it, including a number of quite big research reports about what to do, because it's a real ethical challenge, really. And what it really comes down to, I mean, I don't know what you would do about bringing the brother into the conversation. You'd have to experiment and see, but clearly that's what the family had done, and they'd found that every time they did, the mum was asking where he was, and then they're in this difficult situation if they tell her she's upset. This is really, really hard. The problem really is that in the end, it can seem, and may well be, kinder to a person in that situation to not tell them the truth. So not to say that somebody's died. If they've already been told and they've already grieved, then telling them again is just putting them through all that again, which is just awful. And they may, quarter of an hour later, they may not remember what it was they were told, but they'll still feel terrible and they won't know why. And that's really, really challenging. And so there's a lot of discussion about whether it's okay in situations like that to simply withhold the truth, or to tell a little white lie that gets around it. Says, oh, he'll be along when he can, or whatever. Part of the problem is that we come up against our own scruples, really. We don't like lying. We feel wrong, we feel guilty if we don't tell the truth. But on the other hand, we'll feel guilty if we tell the truth and it has a bad effect. So there's no way out of that. There is no solution to that. And I think all you can really do is think a bit about what you would do in other situations where that came up. So for example, if your best friend said, look, do you like my new dress? And you thought it was hideous, you probably wouldn't say it's hideous. You'd find somebody to bypass that so that you didn't hurt your friend's feelings, even if you didn't actually lie. You might say, well, I like the belt, because the belt is okay, but the rest of it's awful, or whatever. Or, oh, it's a nice length. You find something to say that was true, even though you were bypassing the real question. And so if we can do that with other people, why would we not do it with people living with a dementia? I'll share with you the story that I often tell about how my mum dealt with the question we used to ask when we were kids. Well, we didn't ask it very often, actually, but my siblings and I, we would say, is there really a Father Christmas? And on the one hand, my mother absolutely hated lying. She just didn't lie. It just was something she didn't do. But on the other hand, she didn't want to spoil anything for us. And so what she used to say was, for as long as there are little children, there will always be a Father Christmas. And I think that is a masterful way of dealing with answering that question, because children will will be able to say, oh, right, hey, well, there are always little children. So yeah, if there are always little children, there'll always be a Father Christmas. So yes, there is a Father Christmas. So they're absolutely fine with that because they've been told a truth that makes sense to them. It's just that there's another layer of truth behind it, which has been withheld for them out of kindness. And I think this is really the core thing, is what is going to be the kindest thing to say to that person? And sometimes the kindest thing is to tell them the truth, because they need to know the truth, and it will confuse them if you don't tell them the truth, even if the truth is painful. Like, for example, if they're, if a close relative has just died and they've never been told before, well, they have the right to be told that, because it's part of life that we have to go through these things. But if it will be kindest to step round the truth in some kind of way, then I think we shouldn't trip over our own scruples on that, because in other situations we don't. So why would we here?
It's a massive conversation that we have in our courses, and we include it, a discussion around it, but it's that internal sort of grapple, isn't it? Like, how do I feel? What's my agenda? I can't lie, but I don't want to upset this person any more than I don't want to upset them. So what can I do? What would be the best solution? And sometimes there just isn't a best solution. And it's just
nobody chooses to be in a situation where it's two wrongs, and two wrongs don't make a right. It's one wrong or another wrong, and it's just a question of which one is kinder to the other person, and can you hack it if it's not the kindest one for you.
Just to give an ending to that sort of story, so we sort of talked about it quite a bit in that session. And one of the options was, because he'd always worked away, it was quite a natural thing that he'd be working away. So they started to use that, is away, is working, but then talk about him in a happy way.
Nice.
Which was really nice. So mom still got to talk about the happy memories, thinking about what they'd done and the holidays they'd had and the Christmases they'd had together. So you've still got the joy. And actually that was really good for the daughter, because she hadn't been able to have any of those happy stories, which we all, when we're grieving, those happy stories are the things that we look for. So it seemed to work well for them. Yeah. But there's no obvious easy answer, and it's a very tricky one. Right, I'm going to give you a 1 minute warning now, everybody. If you have questions for Alison, this is your time to drop them into the Q&A, which is just at the bottom of your screen. Alison, one of the things I love about your book is that at the end of every chapter, there's little action points. And I'm a lady that likes an action point. So there's an action point if you're living with dementia, there's an action point if you're caring for somebody, and there's an action point for professionals, and there's these little bullet points of what you could do. And I think that's absolutely magical. So thank you so much for including those in the book. All right, this is a really tricky question. It's sort of similar to the one that I opened with. What's your final piece of advice for a carer or a professional?
Yeah, it's a really good question, isn't it? I think it comes back to kindness. We all know how to be kind, but we easily forget to be kind because we're so bound up in all the things that have to be done, in our own needs. It's very easy to just forget to put the kindness cloak on, if you like. Now, there is a secret to this, because for as long as being kind is at odds with the other things you need to achieve, it's going to be a battle. So the secret to this is to rethink what's most important to you and what you most need to do. You can align the things that you want to do with being kind. So instead of thinking, I must do the ironing and that's the most important thing, and I must get the washing up done, I must make the dinner or whatever else. Those things may need to be done, but no, my major priority is to make sure that mum feels contented, or mum's settled, or that mum ends up getting the things that she needs, so I can be kind, so she feels nice, And then you think, well, actually, every time I'm kind, I'm actually achieving my major goals. And if in the course of that something else doesn't quite get done, it doesn't matter, because my major goal is to be kind. And that gives you permission to be the person you really want to be. And by being kind to them, you'll get the best out of them, but you'll also get the best out of yourself, because you won't be in this constant fight with yourself where you know that you wish you could, you know, treat the situation a little bit differently, but somehow you can't. Just align your expectations. It could simply be kindness is what we're doing today, kindness and rest. And if nothing else gets done, that's fine. And then little things will get done. You know, you will make the dinner and everything like that, but it ceases to be kind of the thing that's driving you. So that would be my bit of advice, is to find a way to prioritize kindness as what you most want to achieve.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for that one. I'm writing down kindness. Kindness, be more kind. Yeah. I've put it down. They're being very quiet, Alison. We've not had a question come up yet. Maybe because we've been so thorough with our interview today that we've left nothing uncovered. One of the things that we're not going to talk about today, but we have talked about previously, are the 4 reserves that we include in this book. So what I'll do for anybody who's come along today, I'll include the link, because we've got it on YouTube, so you can go on there and have a quick look. But very, like, in 2 minutes, Alison, just on the reserves, just give us like the titles. We're not going into it in depth because that's impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. So the key thing about the reserve, there are 4 types of reserve, basically, as I see it. One of them is called brain reserve, and it's about how resilient the brain is to actually developing dementias in the first place. That's not something we can really control all that much. There's cognitive reserve, which is talked about quite a lot, which is once you've got a dementia, how resilient are you to the effects of the symptoms? And that's something we have a certain amount of control over, because we can use our brain in ways that challenge it and get it used to finding alternative solutions, so that if there's a little bit of a blockage in being able to achieve a task, we've got an opportunity to do it in another way. So we're used to doing that. So we can do that through crosswords, Wordle. If you haven't found Wordle and you've got a computer, get onto Wordle, or Quaddle, which has got 4 of them at the same time, which is really does your head in. Then the other 2 are ones that I came up with for myself. One is social reserve, and this is to do with the extent to which we in society and we as individuals make it easier for a person living with a dementia to live well with dementia. In other words, it's not a foregone conclusion how badly somebody's symptoms will affect them. It very much depends on what they're encountering every day, how easily they can get services, how helpful people are, and so on. And this is something that is under our control to quite an extent. And then emotional reserve is the 4th one. And this is how resilient people are to how it feels on the day to be dealing with particular things. How long does it take you to get completely ground down by what's going on? And you will immediately see social reserve and emotional reserve apply to carers as well, really important. So we can help build people's emotional reserve, whether they're living with a dementia or caring for somebody who is, by providing more social reserve, by being more supportive of them, ensuring that things are easier for them to achieve, giving them encouragement, building their confidence, and so on, so that they don't feel alone and don't feel abandoned.
Thank you for that. So I'll include the link in the email that you will get tomorrow with more. So I'll have the link for YouTube. So if you want to learn more about reserves, there's a good 20-minute of me and Alison trying to be very quick with that, which isn't that easy. So there's 20 minutes to watch if you're interested, and I'll include it. So Rachel said on your last point, I love that advice, Alison, about kindness. Thank you. The world needs more kindness and compassion. It really does. Now, don't start quaking, but Phil's put a question in. Alison, can you give us an example of the use of trial and error to learn what works?
Well, it's so difficult in the abstract, really. But I mean, let me just go back to that example of the daughter and the mother with the biscuits. So what I was trying to put across there was that the daughter might think, I wonder if there's an alternative way to deal with this. Every time I look in the cupboard, I get cross. I can always feel cross even before I open the cupboard door, because I know how I'm going to feel. I mean, we've all been there with things. And so just stepping back and say, well, what would be an alternative? If I saw those biscuits as an opportunity to make a donation to the food bank or something like, would that work? She doesn't know if that will work or not. She doesn't know what her mum will say when she says, oh, look, we're going out, why don't we take some of those biscuits down and put them into the food bank, so you've made a donation or whatever, or give them to the club. So she'll try that. And then if it didn't work, instead of saying, oh, crazy, stupid me, I'm useless, whatever, say, no, okay, so that didn't work. I wonder why that didn't work. Is there a version of that might have worked, or is that never going to work? Was it because of the day? Was it because of where it was? And so it's just about looking at what the parameters are and sort of just figuring out what might work for that person on a particular occasion. Often you can't really generalize because everybody's different. No two people with dementia are the same. No two family members are the same. No two situations are the same. So trial and error really is about, it might not even work for anybody else, but it might work for us. But the other thing to do, of course, particularly if people are involved in a group like Empowered Conversations, is to ask around what other people have tried. What would you do in this situation? You don't have to do what they say they would do, but you can at least ask them what they do and see if it gives you any ideas about what might work for you.
There's a lot of pondering, isn't there? Like as you're walking the dogs, or that time where you can just think, oh, that didn't quite work, but I wonder if I do it that way, would it work? So there's a lot of reflection or pondering.
It's much better than that. The other thing that can happen, which you spend the whole time just rehearsing all the things that are going wrong and just kind of digging yourself into this deep emotional hole where you feel that you can't escape. It's a creative way out of that. That's what's really important.
Thank you for that answer. Margaret said, is it useful or not to ask a person with dementia opinions on local or national news?
It depends on the person, but I would give it a go. Why not? They may not be up to date with what's going on in the world. They may not recall all the background, but it might lead somewhere. I mean, at the moment, if you've got a person with dementia sitting in front of the news about Ukraine, and you say, oh, that looks like war, what do you think about that? They'll probably have something to say about it, even if they then say, oh, it reminds me of what it was like for me when I was a child and in the Second World War. Well, great, talk about that then. They don't have to have great opinions about what's happening, but it's a way in. Yeah, I would use the newspaper, look at things and say, what do you think about that? And just give them a chance to talk, really.
It's just opening up those opportunities rather than closing them down and thinking, oh no, they won't have an opinion on that. We'll not bother with that.
Give it a go, yeah.
Okay, we have another question here from Michelle. Let's just scroll down. I've noticed that my husband has started putting things in slightly the wrong place in cupboards. Do I tell him or just move it?
No, you'd have to experiment and see what happens. I mean, I wonder why he's doing that, whether he just can't recall where they are supposed to go. I mean, whose cupboards are there? Very often, I'm afraid, the bloke doesn't really know where everything goes in the cupboard anyway.
Oh, Alison, you've not said that. I can't believe it.
But no, I mean, I don't know. Does it matter is one thing. How much is it going to matter if that thing's in the wrong place? Is it going to make it harder for you to find it next time? What's practical? Is he going to notice if you've moved it? Is he put it there because it's easier for him to find? In which case, that's quite a good reason to leave it there. But if he's left it there because he didn't know where else to put it back to where you can find it. Otherwise, you're both going to not know where it is. You've got to experiment. I don't know that there's a simple answer to that. But
Michelle, you've got to be a detective on that one. Really, a proper detective. Write him down, which one works, which one doesn't, and start to have that pondering curiosity about what may work. Michelle, you've asked us.
The key thing there, Michelle, would be to try and resist telling him off for putting them in the wrong place, because that he's not putting them in the wrong place on purpose. So he's just going to feel rubbish then, and that won't, I guess, and that won't help. So trying to figure out what's going through his mind when he's putting those there. Yeah.
And a lot of people, Michelle, will be just happy that they're in a cupboard. From other experiences, they don't even get in a cupboard. But that's my life. I won't talk about it. You've asked another question. I've realised as well that it's best if I don't tell my husband something is happening. For example, if we're going to go out somewhere for the afternoon, I don't tell him until a few hours before, as I notice that he'll get ready hours before or keep on about it.
Yeah. That's quite common. I mean, that's a kind of anxiety. Will I be ready? What do I have to do to be ready? So as long as you feel you've got that under control, that, you know, you can, if he has half an hour to get ready, that's about the right amount of time. That's a good time to tell him. Yeah, that I think quite a lot of people would do that.
And it sounds like Michelle's already found out that that's the right thing to do. So that trial and error, actually telling him the night before and in the morning that we're going to go to the supermarket in the afternoon, just leads to quite a lot of frustration from me saying, take your coat off, we're not going yet, take your coat off, we're not going yet, and that sort of repetitiveness.
And again, it comes down to, you know, why do we tend to tell people ages in advance what we or they are doing anyway? Probably because we're trying to clock it in our own mind, trying to say, right, okay, because we're going there this afternoon, I've got to do this, and so notice that you need to clock that you're going out this afternoon. But instead of telling him, find another way to clock that so that you keep in mind and keep all the ducks lined up, and then you can tell him at the appropriate time. And again, I mean, I really don't like to liken it to how we deal with children, because there are so many differences. But it is true that also with a young child, you might well not tell them 3 days in advance you're going to the zoo, because you never get the end of it, and so you just wait until later on and then tell them, and so on. So, you know, we can learn from other parts of life. We just need to not overgeneralize on that, because people with dementia are not children, but there's sometimes we can learn. We have strategies for dealing with communication with people, so we should expect that they cross-fertilize a little bit.
Thank you for that. We're in our last 2 minutes, so if you've got a burning question or you want to congratulate Alison on a wonderful webinar, then please pop it in to the chat or the Q&A now. We have another webinar next week. It's with Agnes Houston, who will be talking about the sensory issues and challenges faced by people with dementia. So look out for that one. Barbara has said, awesome as ever. Thank you.
Thank you. I like the as ever.
As ever. Yeah, constantly awesome. And Margaret said, many thanks for a helpful session. Oh, they're coming in thick and fast now. Flipping it. Can't keep on top. It was lovely to hear you say things that I can relate to, Michelle.
Oh, I'm glad, Michelle. I'm glad to hear that. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, there's lots of lovely comments there. Thanks so much, Alison and Emma. Some great specific resolution ideas. Thanks, Alison. A great session. Brilliant, thanks. Oh my Lord, Alison, do you need to get out your door in a minute? You won't be able to. Your head will be so enlarged. Wonderful. So just it leaves it to me to say thank you, Alison, for your time today. I hugely appreciate it, as always, and the input that you have into Empowered Conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. I hope that you have a lovely afternoon, and I will see you all soon.
Bye.